Welcome to the Audacious OBM podcast. I'm your host, Leanne Woff, creator of OBM Academy and founder of Audacious Empires. Each week, my crew and I will explore all things building and scaling an exceptional OBM business. This podcast is here to share how you can charge premium prices, have clients lining up to work with you, and never have to work another weekend again. You can have a thriving OBM business working with the clients you want, when you want, and charging the price you want. It's time to banish mediocre and become the standout, sought after OBM you know you can be. Hey, lovely. Welcome to this week's episode of the Audacious OBM podcast. Today's episode is called Stop Being Selfish and Start Asking More Questions. And this episode, we are going to cover 8 types of questions that you should be asking your clients on a regular basis. The reason that I wanted to talk about questions is because I think that sometimes they can make or break the way we execute any project or any relationship or ongoing work with a client. Questions are crucial, and we need to get over our fear of asking them. Because what I've found is that when we don't ask questions or we don't ask the right questions, things get disastrous pretty quickly. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story first, for some context. We were working with a client, and this client had been referred to by somebody else, and it was all going really well, had a conversation and seemed great. And then somebody else said to us, just don't ask any questions. If you ask questions, they'll get really defensive, they'll get annoyed. You're better off just not asking any questions. So I thought, okay. That's interesting, but all right. I can definitely come with an approach where it is a matter of me coming up with a concept or a solution first or a recommendation and then seeing what comes off the back of that instead of asking questions. Although I just thought that's interesting. And it made me feel a little bit worried because now I couldn't ask the questions. I couldn't find out the information that I would usually want to get to know first. And then what happened over the next couple of weeks, there was this disjointed relationship happening. And what I ended up getting told by the client is, I don't understand. Why didn't you just ask me this? Or why didn't you just ask me that? And I would have told you all this stuff. And I said, got told not to ask any questions. I was like, no, I'm happy to answer questions. I don't like questions that have no purpose. Questions that are relevant, 100%. Ask me all the questions. I do not mind. And after that, it changed very quickly. I was able to do my job properly because now I didn't have this pool of information being withheld from me because I couldn't ask any questions about it. And so it was after that first few weeks that we really got the traction that we had been trying to get this entire time. And everybody got a lot less frustrated. It has taught me we need to ask the questions. And if we're told not to ask the questions, we need to push back on that because it is an unrealistic expectation and it does not serve anybody. So why don't we ask questions? Insecurity, ego. They're the 2 core reasons why we won't ask someone questions if we don't understand or if we need more information. We're worried that we'll be perceived as dumb, as not understanding when we should, as not being as competent or capable, as damaging our reputation by asking questions like that. We're concerned someone will get annoyed because we're asking too many questions, so we don't. But can I tell you that the consequence of not asking those questions ends up reinforcing all of those things anyway. People are going to get more annoyed if you don't ask the question and then they don't get the results because you never had the information first. If you spend hours and hours trying to find an answer to a question that your client could have answered in 1 second. I guarantee you, when you tell your client about that, they're going to come back and they're going to say, why didn't you just ask me? Instead, we've delayed this thing by a week or however long because you were looking for an answer you didn't have, and I could have solved that very quickly. Or we're going to damage our reputation and our brand for being highly capable because we don't know when to ask and when not to. And instead, the results that we get aren't as good as they can be because we didn't have the information up front. So when we're looking at these things, we really need to remember the questions are important, more so than all of the fears and the stories that we have built up around those questions. What is the impact of not asking questions? Not asking essential questions hampers growth. You cannot grow without asking the right questions. It hampers creativity. Unless you ask questions and get a nice baseline, you don't know what you're working with. And then you don't know what you can springboard off. How often have you had a meeting with a client where you're trying to soundboard or you're both trying to come up with a new idea to do something and there's been no questions asked? Never. Questions breed creativity because they spark something in the other person that you're speaking to. It gives them an idea to leverage off, even if the answer is, oh, well, I definitely don't want to do that. So that means it's got to be the opposite. Let's go this way. And then we come to another question. And then that gives us more ideas. Questions breed creativity. We don't ask the right questions, we increase rework. And either our clients pay for that or we pay for that. Both scenarios, we don't want happening. Without asking questions, we increase frustration and friction. We're going to have these constant back and forth annoyance in conversation because we haven't been able to ask the question, because we weren't brave enough to ask the question, because we're trying to work out creative ways to ask the question that we really want to ask. We're not getting the answer that we need to actually do our job. And then on the flip side, our clients are sitting there going, what is it they're trying to ask me? They've asked me 15 questions and still are asking me more questions, when really, if we just asked the question that we needed the answer to originally, we'd be asking one question. Far better scenario. In saying all of this, I encourage you to ask more questions. When we do not ask the questions, we are being selfish. We are prioritizing our safety and our comfort, our reputation, our insecurities over the outcome that we're trying to achieve for our clients. And that's not fair. So we just want to reframe that a little bit. And with that comes a warning. I don't want you to use questions as a cop-out or a stalling tactic. Questions are not to be used as a cop-out or a stalling tactic. What do I mean by that? I have noticed this pattern in people where if we feel uncomfortable or we've made a mistake, we use questions as a way to cover it. So for instance, if we are delayed in delivering something and we know we're delayed and we know the client is going to ask about why we're delayed if we take much longer, what I have seen some OBMs do is go back to the client and ask a really silly question. Do you want this in purple or green? Well, where is the backlog of titles I can use? These questions aren't terrible questions, but in the context of what you're doing, they absolutely are. Because they're being asked so that then the OBM, a week later, when the client comes back and says, where's this up to? The OBM can then say, oh, well, I'm still waiting for your answer on this before I can even start it. And it's just not true. Both of those questions, you could have got 99% of the job done without the answer to that question. It is not an excuse. And you've created a question to give you the breathing room that you needed to catch up And then all of a sudden it becomes the client's fault and responsibility that they didn't answer that. And that is not what questions are for. Do not create scenarios like that where you can flip the blame or ditch the responsibility because someone hasn't answered the question that you had that you really didn't need the answer for right now. Don't do it. Because then what also happens is when you ask real questions, you're greeted with someone who's annoyed. Because then we never know if questions are genuine or not. In saying all of those things, ask better questions. Ask good questions. Lots of them. What is a good question? A good question is clear and it's current. So, a good question is clear. We're not using lots and lots of different words or bridges in our question so that then when we're asking it, it's confusing to answer. We want to know exactly why we're asking a question before we ask it. If you know why or the answer that you're trying to get, your question will be a lot clearer because you won't be trying to come up with the question as you're saying it. You won't be finishing the idea in your head while you're asking it. And then that just makes it harder for someone to answer. So know the answer you're trying to get to when you're asking a question. It needs to be clear. Questions need to be concise. Do not use lots and lots of words when a few will do. Each question should have a specific purpose. Use the words that will get you to that purpose. If you're wanting to know if the color that you're going to use, if you're going to use the primary blue color from the brand, or if you're going to use the secondary blue color from the brand, ask that. Do you want it to be the primary blue or the secondary blue? Don't ask, hey, I'm doing this new design and I've got to pick the colors for it and I'm wondering which color I should use. That's not the question that you really need an answer to. The client's then going to say, hey, go back to the brand palette. And you're going to say, I already did that, but I don't know which blue. See how it's totally different now? Ask the question that you want to ask and be concise. Questions should be contextual. If you're having a conversation with someone, make sure the questions that you're asking are relevant to that conversation. And if they're not, wait until the end of the conversation to ask about something else. If someone is talking to you about designing this amazing PDF and you have a question about how it's going to be delivered, wait until you've finished the design aspect of the conversation to ask that question. Otherwise, it's too disjointed and our brains jump everywhere and we get confused. And then you don't get the answers that you need. So make sure they're contextual and make sure they're current. Don't ask questions about things that don't matter anymore. Think about the questions that you have and go, okay, I know that 5 years ago, we used to write meta descriptions that had to be 2 words long. What 240 words do you want me to use? Don't ask that question if you know that now meta descriptions need to be 120 words long. It's out of date information. And regardless of how we used to do it, we need to frame questions in the way that is current. Hey, I know these used to be 240 words, but it's changed to 120. What's our process for doing that? And do we need to retrospectively go and change all the old ones from 240 to 120? It's that simple. It becomes current. We're not just talking about previous things for no reason, or we're not just asking questions about things that don't matter anymore. We've eliminated that process, or we don't have that product. It doesn't matter anymore. Now that we have our pattern for good questions and we know that we need to ask more questions, what kind of questions do we need to ask? I've come up with 8. And if I'm honest with you, I could have come up with more. I actually found this quite fun. And I just thought about the different types of questions that I ask my clients regularly. And like everything else, I've put them in categories because I think if you can have categories, you can always work from that to customize it for yourself. Whereas if I just gave you a list of really specific questions, they're a one-time use thing. So I'd rather give you the principle. So the first type is unblocking questions. These are questions that will stop the bottlenecks and that will keep work progressing. These can be questions that are for you specifically. These can be questions that you're asking so that you can keep a team moving forward. It's going back to your client and saying, hey, I know that your days are booked back to back for the next week. What that means is that you're not going to be able to review this piece of work that I need reviewed in 2 days. What are we going to do here? Because I can't move forward with that unless you've reviewed it and I can't see a gap. Is there something we can move? Can you move this thing so that you can review this so that I can keep going? Otherwise, the team is going to come to a standstill. Or, hey, I really need to know where you've saved this file because I can't keep working on it without it. I've done as much as I can, and now everything is going to stop unless you give it to me. So an unblocking question. Questions that literally are going to stop everything unless they get an answer. Improvement questions. These types of questions come from when we're looking at something and we want to improve it, or when we've done something and the feedback that we get isn't, this is 100% amazing, which is fair enough. 100% is a pretty epic result. And very rarely are we going to nail it like that every time. So we need questions that we can ask to get closer to that 100% as we're working with people. These are improvement questions. And it might be when you show your client something and then you say, is this what you had in mind? And then that gives them the ability to say, yeah, mostly, but I would really love it if we had used the secondary blue. If they've come back and they don't really like the process you've created or the tool that you've used or some piece of it doesn't quite fit. And then you get to ask in the future, would it be better if I tried this approach? Is that going to work better for you? And we're creating improvements with each thing we're delivering. I've noticed this in this process. Is it cool with you if we change it to this? Because it's more efficient. It means that it's going to take this person on the team half the amount of time. And then we hand it over to the next person because they're heaps better at it. Improvement questions, making things better. Decision questions. These are questions that you ask to get an executive decision. Hey, I really need to know if we're launching in May or if we're launching in June because we're getting way too close to the deadline and we are not going to be ready in time. I need the decision. I need the decision on whether we're going to price this at $97 or $497. It's decisions that you cannot make without your client. So it's that executive weight and that someone needs to lead here and it needs to be the client. So I need you to answer this question for me. Strategic questions. Love me a little bit of strategy. I love when things have purpose. I love when things have planning. Strategic questions are questions that you ask to come up with a strategy or to improve a strategy. In an ideal world, what would your role be here? It gives your clients freedom to create their role in that strategy. It gives them a door to vent all of their thoughts and feelings or their vision of what they want and fill you in at the same time. Are we wanting to go in this direction when we create this product? Or are we wanting to go in a different direction? Which one did you have in mind? It's telling you information so you can ask follow-up questions. It's telling you information so that when you go and create a strategy for whatever you're creating it for, you have some foundations there. Why are we even doing this activity? What results do we want to get here? Without that, how are you going to create a strategy? If you don't know where you're going or what you're trying to achieve, how can you work out the best way for this client to get there? So there's strategic questions. Clarifying questions. This 100% is something that OBMs do not do enough of. And it's quite simple. When you have a conversation with one of your clients, clarify what you've heard and what you're going to do based on that. From what you've said, I'm hearing that I'm going to grow, I'm going to create 6 months worth of socials, the copy, the graphics. I'm going to create a system for which that'll happen so that next time someone else can do it. I'm going to create a process for the scheduling, and I'm going to create a process for the approval. Then I'm going to walk you through it. Does that sound good? Or is that right? That simple. Repeating back based on the things we've talked about. This is what I'm hearing and this is what I'm going to do. Or this is what you're thinking and feeling. Is that correct? Because if we've missed a piece, we're going to save so much time up front by clarifying. Communication is an art. There's so many different courses that you can go and do, even in university level, around communication, because we all communicate differently. Therefore, clarifying things is really important. Historic questions. Historic questions are when you ask questions about things that have happened previously in the business. So what series of events led us here? Why did we choose to do webinars? Why is this person's file totally different to everybody else's? Trying to get context based on the past, you need historic questions. And it's okay to ask them because it gives you the context to make better decisions for the future, which is what we want. Perspective shifting questions. These are my favorite. And the reason for that is that it gives us the opportunity to expand with our clients. If we're noticing something, or we notice hesitation, or we notice a roadblock, or we notice a hesitation towards an opportunity, we can ask perspective shifting questions to see where the block really is or to open more doors for them. What that means is if we're saying, oh, yeah, I would really love to go and do that, and I can see the value that it would bring to the business, but I just don't have the time, you could say something like, but what if we found the time? If we could find the time, is it still something that you would want to do? Yeah, but I'm scared. Okay, so what are the ways we could find the time? Let's just pretend. And then we start thinking about ways we could find the time. You can do this for all different types of objectives and all different types of hurdles. What if instead of it being the person on the other end of the line being an idiot, it's because we haven't clarified what the process is at the beginning? So what if we just fixed the process? Then maybe we would get less of these calls and you wouldn't be as stressed. What do you think of that? So we're helping them look at things in a different way that opens more doors and solves more problems. Perspective shifting questions. They're fantastic. Use them. And then the last type of question is the I give a crap questions. I am a peopler, and if you don't have good relationships with your clients, then what on earth are you doing working with them? You cannot work that closely with a business and not feel connected to them or be invested in what they're doing. It's just not the way it's going to work well. These questions are questions like, how are you? A questions like, how is your son feeling? A question like, hey, how did your daughter go in the grand final? Hey, are you feeling less wobbly today? Is there something I can do for you? Hey, that sounds like an amazing idea, as long as it's not going to be too much for you to do, because then you'll be stressed and I don't want you to end up stressed. Questions that show you care. Questions that show you give a crap, just like the toilet paper. And that's it. There are 8 categories of questions. This episode has well and truly given you enough to ask better questions, the right questions, to know that you need to ask questions. Now, my challenge for you is to go and do it. from tomorrow, start asking more questions and send me a DM. If you're listening to this and you're going to start asking more questions, send me a DM and tell me which category you think you need to work on. I need to ask more questions like this. I want to know, be part of the conversation. This doesn't have to be a monologue, and I love it when I get messages from listeners. You know where to find me, at Leanne Woff. Come talk to me, come say hi. I hope that you have a wonderful day. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave me a review, and I will see you next week. Bye, guys. Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of the Audacious OBM. We hope this episode has helped you move forward in your journey to being a standout and sought after OBM. If you enjoyed the episode, take a second to rate and review. Each review helps us to help other OBMs just like you. If you're interested in learning more about OBM Academy and all that it offers, head over to audaciousempires.com to get all the juicy details. We'll be back next week.